Next one, it has face value or the par value of that particular bond. Okay, so on a piece of paper, okay, what will happen is that you will find the amount of that bond. Just like, for example, maybe 100,000 USD. It also indicates an interest rate of the bond, and of course, lastly, it has the name of company and the maturity of that bond. Okay, and the payments will happen, let's say, for example, on an annual basis. Okay. Next one, equity. Okay. The first characteristics of an equity is that there is a variability in income. Okay, you're not guaranteed how much you're supposed to receive from equity investments because the equity is dividend is dependent on how much the company has performed in terms of its financial and business operations. So no need to say, okay, if the company makes more profit or income, of course, potentially the dividends that the stockholders will receive also is higher. Okay, if the income of the company is lower, there are times or maybe years that our income is not so good. Okay, our income goes down. Potentially also the dividends that we will receive from this particular year is also down. There are also a possibility that there are years or maybe a particular date that we don't receive any dividends because the company is at loss or the company has financial troubles or the company has projects and they don't have extra funding to release as a dividend. Okay, so in that case, it is fluctuating. Therefore, some investors would like this type of investment because they have the power to actually choose whether they go for higher dividends or fluctuating type of income. Okay, so other investors would go for this, especially if they are risk takers. Okay, second one, if you're a stockholder of a company, definitely you have all the right to claim to the claims of the income of the company. Just like, for example, if you buy shares from Artel and you become a stockholder of Artel, whatever the assets, whatever the liabilities, and whatever is the residual value, especially the income, as a stockholder, you have all the rights to claim. Of course, these rights are subjected to the decision of the board of directors, okay, of the company. Third one, it says the receipt of your income is undefined and unlimited. What do you mean by undefined? There's no specific time, there's no specific amount of how much you will receive and when do you receive this amount. Okay. Third one, this next one is unlimited. Okay, as I have mentioned earlier, if the company is making a lot of profit, you also make a lot of money. Okay, if the company is going downward in terms of its income, then also the dividends will go downward. So therefore, there's no limitation. Okay. Next question. Okay, why do we choose bonds over other types of investment? Okay, the first thing that we have to understand is that bonds offer a better rate compared with bank deposits. Okay, because bonds, because it is long-term investment, you also notice that the interest is quite higher compared with a savings account. Okay, because in a savings account, especially internationally, the amount of savings account, just like in my country, is like 0.05 or less than 1 or half of a 1, maybe up to 2% for savings account. If you have time deposits, maybe it will be around 5%. But bonds usually have higher interest rate because of the characteristic that it is a long-term type of investment. Okay. Second one, it says it is less risky compared with equity. Okay. Why less risky? Because the nature of bond is a fixed income, which means to say you are guaranteed that every year, if the payment is annual, you will always receive that interest yearly, on a yearly basis. Unlike in equity, as I have mentioned earlier, if there is money, there's income, then you receive dividends based on the approval of the board of director. If there's no income, then don't expect dividends to be paid. Okay, and the third one, it says active liquid market, because bonds are easily sold in the bonds market. Okay, and also some other types of short-term and long-term investments. So in terms of liquidity, you can easily sell. You can also easily buy these bonds in the bonds market. So in terms of reinvesting, there's always a good opportunity. Okay, unlike in the other types. Okay, what are the risks involved in bonds? Okay, one of them is actually credit. Okay, or because a bond is actually a liability or debt instrument, there is a possibility that the company is not able to pay, first of all, the interest payments on an annual basis, and in the long term period there's also a potential that the company is not able to pay the amount of the bond, the principal amount. That's why some investors don't like long-term investments. Okay, just like me personally, I don't like long-term investments because we don't know what will happen in the future. Okay, there are circumstances today that might not be true anymore after 5 years, or maybe the condition of that corporation is not anymore as healthy financially after 5 years. So some investors would prefer short term because of the risk involved. Okay. Second one, interest rate risk. Okay. Because the bonds is a fixed type of income, you receive the same interest amount every year. The problem is that some other types of investments have fluctuating interest rates. It means to say, as long as you're able to play on the market, you might have an income that is fluctuating and which is good for you. Okay, but the problem with the bond is that because it is the same amount that you receive, then a possibility that you lose the opportunity to earn in fluctuating type of interest rates. Okay, and that's one risk also. Reinvestment. Okay, investors usually, when they receive the payment from their investment, what they actually do is reinvest the same amount, or maybe add some more and put it in another investment. Okay, the problem with this one, especially in a long-term basis, is that you might not be able to receive the amount of your investment as a payment. Okay, as like for example, you waited for 5 years. In 5 years, you did not receive the principal amount plus the interest because the company is already into a financial difficulty. So that's one risk. You cannot reinvest the amount. Inflation or purchasing power. Okay. Let me give you this as an example. Okay. The water is there. This bottle of water. Okay. 5 months ago, if I go to the cafeteria, I usually buy this one with 1,500 sums. Today, it's not anymore. You eat at cafeteria, you observe that you pay a little more compared to how many months ago, like 5 months ago. Let's say, for example, if you eat 15,000 sums, today you will pay around 22. Okay? And eating the same items of food that you had last time. Okay? So it means to say, salary is the same. Sorry to say. The items are more expensive. So now we have a issue of inflation. Okay, it's the same thing with your investment. Just like your salary, if your salary continues to be the same amount, but the prices are going upward, then you have an issue how to handle the increasing amount of prices of commodities. Okay, you have to make sure that your salary will meet the other end. Okay, let's say for example, end of the month. Same with your investment. If you invest in a long-term investment, especially in a bond wherein the interest rate is fixed, okay, after 5 years, definitely this amount that you're expecting today is not the same value 5 years later. It's like, for example, you invest 100,000 USD in bonds with a 10% interest annually. So you try to calculate 100,000 multiplied by 10, multiplied by 5 years. You're expecting that amount. But that USD amount definitely do not have the same purchasing power as today. So therefore, you also have to reconsider that risk involved, especially in inflation or purchasing power. That's why some investors, rather than doing the long-term investment, they will do short-term investments like 1 year or less. Because mostly the power of your money today and 1 year later at least it's not very how to say, there's not so much of a big significance in terms of purchasing power. Okay? It's almost the same, or maybe especially if you have a 6 months investment, definitely the power of 50,000 zooms today is almost the same like 5 months later. Okay, so next one is income from equity. Okay, so shares of stocks or owning a shares of stocks, one of the characteristics, unlike in the bond, is that the investment has no fixed date as when to receive the dividends. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there's no specific amount of how much you are supposed to receive from the corporation or the company. Okay. Second one, it says there are price fluctuations. Okay? Especially if you're playing around with the stock market, you're a short-term investor or trader. Okay? The prices of the stocks compared with the bonds, especially the interest is fixed, there is a possibility that you can make more profit with the equity shares because the prices are fluctuating. There are days in the stock market wherein the market is very active. Okay? The prices, the investors are very positive. There's high demand for a particular shares in industry. So what will happen is that the prices will go upward. There are also times wherein the stock market is down. Okay? And you notice that the prices are on red, okay? Which means to say the stock market is not positive on that day. So there's always a fluctuation. So as an investor, your responsibility is to make sure that you understand how the market actually works so that you can play around and you can maximize whatever potential you have as an investor. Okay. Next one, it says dividends. Okay. Again, just like the shares of the prices, there's also no specific rule when to pay the dividends and how much is the dividend to be paid. Okay, that's very, very clear. It means to say, as the corporation makes money, we make more dividends or we make more profit. What are the types of financial securities? There's one that we call primary securities or issued by government or corporations or firms. Sometimes the government also need funding. Okay, just like for example, if you're watching the news right now, there is a typhoon happening in Japan. That's like 2 days ago, okay, or like 2 or 3 days ago. Okay, so if you're following the news, you notice that houses were destroyed, some buildings were destroyed, cars were blown away by the typhoon. Okay, and in Southeast Asia, okay, especially where we come from, Singapore and like Philippines, Japan, China, Hong Kong, these countries are experiencing calamities, or we call it natural disaster. Okay, so year after year, governments around the world prepare budget for the year, but sometimes there are incidents, there are events that will happen like these natural calamities, and it will damage our resources as a city, let's say buildings, bridges, hospitals, airports, and it's not part of our budget. Okay, so the government will have or will require emergency funding. So what they can actually do is issue securities, that's like bonds. Okay, they can issue a bond, and they will issue it to the public investors. So after issuing, the government now has a funding or extra funding to continue operation, just like for example repair hospitals, repair bridges, repair the roads. Okay, and these are part of the investment opportunities that we can take. The government's investment are very secured, just like for example government bonds, because government technically are not supposed to be into bankruptcy or will not go into bankruptcy technically. Okay, so because it's very secure type of investment, you will also notice that the interest rates provided by this type of investment is also quite low. As they say, the higher the risk, the higher the income. These are low risk type of investments. So therefore, the income from investment in government securities are also quite low. Okay. There's also what we call derivatives securities. These are issued by individual trader. I will explain later what is a derivative. Okay. Next. Treasury bills. The bonds is a piece of paper which indicates the name of company, the amount of that bond, the face value, interest rate, and also maturity. Treasury bills is also a piece of paper, okay? But the name is, let's say for example, U.S. Treasury. Okay, it's issued by the Treasury Department of a country. Okay, just like for example in Uzbekistan you have Treasury Department. This Treasury Department of the government takes care of all the cash resource in this country. Just like for example those collected from taxes, the Bureau of Taxation will not keep the money. They will forward it to the Treasury Department of every country. So therefore, if the government also requires funding, the Treasury Department will issue that paper, okay, which is called Treasury Bills. Okay? It also indicates an amount, interest, and of course maturity of that bill. Okay? One significant difference or feature of this Treasury bill is usually it is a short-term type of investment, 1 year or less. Okay? There's 90 days, there's 60 days, some even can mature as early as 30 days. Okay? They have interest rates, but the interest rates, because it is secured by government, you also notice that the interest rates are quite low. Just like, for example, 1%, maybe up to 2% globally. Okay? And it says, silent the phone. Okay? They have active secondary market. Okay? Treasury bills are actively traded and actually actively sold and bought in the market. Okay, so you don't have any problem, especially if you don't want to wait anymore for the maturity of that Treasury bill. Just like, for example, some investors don't want to wait for a few months. Okay, so what they actually do is sell the Treasury bills in the market, and they generate the funding on the spot. Okay, government bonds can be very long in terms of investment. Okay, some other government bonds may last for 30 years. Just like, for example, if the collateral is a housing loan, it's like governments provide housing for people. Usually the housing loan will take up to 30 years before it matures. So government may also issue bonds that is equivalent to a 30 years period. Okay. Next, mortgages. Okay, mortgage is a one financial asset. The mortgage loan is one financial asset that we have in the bank.